Hey, previously we posted a transaction from the front end by submitting data through a form in this conduct transaction component. This made a post request to the backend to make a new transaction at the API/transact endpoint. However, in order to view the transaction, we had to manually visit this transaction pool map endpoint. Now, we should give the user the ability to view transactions in the pool within the front end as well. So let's create a new transaction pool component which will display the transactions that are currently in the pool. In the code editor, let's create a new transaction pool.js file, which is going to be a new transaction pool component for the overall application. So make sure the extension is .js. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and import React and the component class from the React module. This will have internal state, so we do want the component class from React. We'll also want to give this transaction pool page a way to navigate back home. Therefore, we're going to import. We'll also want to give this transaction pool page that will be on its own a way to navigate back home. Therefore, we're going to import the link component from React Router DOM. All right. Then we can define a transaction pool class, which will extend our component class from React. So this extends component. The strategy for this transaction pool will be to fetch all the data from the transaction pool map endpoint and then display that. Like the blocks component, as well as the app component for the wallet info, we're going to maintain an internal state to represent the return value of the transaction pool map endpoint. Let's have a transaction pool map key, which is set to an object because the endpoint returns an object from the endpoint itself. Cool. Now we can define a method which will fetch the transaction pool map and then set that result in the state. So let's have a method called fetch transaction pool map. This is set to a JavaScript callback. We'll call fetch and then http://localhost 3000 /API/transaction-pool-map. All right. Like the other fetch methods, we follow with a .then handler because this returns a promise. This will have a callback which will return response.json from the returned response object. And likewise, we can get the resulting JSON in its own .then handler and its own callback. And the result is to call this .setState and set the transaction pool map to the returned JSON within the state itself. Nice. Now we want this data to be available right away, so let's call component did mount. So that way, as soon as a component gets loaded up in the HTML document, we're going to fetch the transaction pool map data. Now we can structure the component with a render method. Overall, we're going to return a div whose overall class name is transaction pool to match the name of the class itself. We're going to have a div that hoses a link component that goes home. And this will have a to property that goes to the /address. Likewise, we'll have our h3 title, and this one will say transaction pool with a space. Then we should render some UI for everything in the transaction pool map. Normally, we would render multiple pieces of JSX by mapping over an array, but the transaction pool map is organized in a key value object format. The keys are transaction IDs, and the values are the transaction objects themselves. But this means that we can conveniently get an array of the actual transaction values by calling object.values and using this .state.transaction pool map. Then we'll map some JSX for every single transaction within this now array of transaction values from the map. Overall, we can return a div, and the key for this can be the unique transaction.id. So the key is the transaction.id, and again, we need the key to avoid the React error that subsequent pieces of JSX generated by an array needs to have a unique key property for the underlying React engine. Okay, then let's provide a header ruler component so that way there's separation between every transaction through a horizontal line. Then we have to render the transaction itself. And luckily, we already have a transaction component in the project that is equipped to render some nice UI for a transaction object. So at the top of the file, let's import the transaction class from the local transaction file. And then after the header ruler element, well, we can render the transaction component by using the transaction JSX. So let's have a self-enclosing transaction tag. The transaction property is going to directly render the transaction object data. Cool. Last up, let's share this transaction pool component by exporting it as the default for this file. So export default transaction pool. All right, that's quite the chunk of code, but make sure you have the transaction pool component code. Overall, it fetches the transaction pool map, sets that in the state, and then renders that result within the actual render function. And it takes advantage of the existing transaction component. All right, to hook this up, we need to add a route to this transaction pool, as well as a link within the app component. First up, the route, let's have a new transaction pool component import within the main index.js file. Too bad it didn't start with a D. We would have had ABCD, but this pattern would have been broken eventually. This will link to a transaction pool endpoint on the actual application / transaction-pool. And then this is going to the new transaction pool component. All right, nice. Finally, with that changing, we can head back to the main app.js component. And let's add a new link that goes to the transaction pool. So the link is transaction-pool. And the link itself is the transaction pool. All right, very nice. Start up the application in the command line if you haven't already by firing npm run dev. Mine has been running in the background, so it picked up my latest changes, which means now in the browser, go ahead and visit localhost 3000, go home. If you refresh, there should be this transaction pool link. Cool. If you click it, well, it should be empty if you haven't made a transaction already. So let's go ahead and create a transaction with the conduct a transaction form. So how about bar address? This will be a transaction of 150, quite an expensive one. Okay, success. We can go home and then click on the transaction pool, and there is a transaction appearing for us. All right, very awesome. So indeed, the recent transaction shows up in the transaction pool. That's pretty good. However, it'd be nice if the user didn't have to manually go all the way back to the home page into the transaction pool to see the result of their recent conduct transaction submission. Let's make this flow programmatic and automatic. After the user gets the alert message, they should be redirected to the transaction pool page automatically. To do this, we can use the history object, which has a nice .push function, which will navigate the user to a different page. In the conducttransaction.js file, so in conducttransaction.js, let's import the history object from its file. Import history from its file, which is located one directory back in the main source folder. And then after the alert message, we're going to call history.push. And this takes an endpoint, and that endpoint is /transaction pool. This will make it so that after closing the alert message, this will push the user to the transaction pool page. Okay, let's check this out in the application. Go home, give it a refresh for good measure, conduct a transaction, and let's do a transaction of 60, or rather a transaction to someone, so how about GOO address, but the value is going to be 60. I'll go ahead and submit that, and then after closing this alert message, we get automatically routed to the transaction pool. All right, very nice. One last thing though, we're gonna make sure this header ruler doesn't span all the way across the window. In the index.css file, we can make sure that in addition to conduct transaction having 10% margin, we can make the transaction pool have a 10% margin as well by including them both as separated by commas to share a common style. Saving that, and you'll see that the transaction pool looks very nice. All right. Now, there's one slight issue with this. What if a peer in the blockchain network posts a transaction? Now, it'd be ideal for this new transaction to appear in the front end as soon as possible. Right now, the only choice that the user has is to give the page a refresh if they want to see that transaction data. As our next solution, we're going to implement some polling logic in the transaction pool component. This will allow the transaction pool map to poll the backend at an interval to give this component the chance to pick up any new transactions that have been posted and broadcasted to the blockchain network. Okay, let's implement this polling logic next.